Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in. One where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. In today's episode, you are going to hear from Vera Kelsey Watts, who uses she and her pronouns and is also one of my mentors. Vera is a financial planner who has a fascination for the many resources in our world, the land, our families, and communities built through individual and shared labor, and the material and immaterial wealth that we build, grow, or inherit. Vera believes that how we manage our resources and make decisions around capital are some of the most important questions we may be faced with in life. Vera has a background in economics, including behavioral economics, and has worked in the nonprofit industry. While she worked in the nonprofit world, she used her logistical, organizing, and accounting skills to support organic farming ventures, serve on publisher editorial boards, and consult with cooperatively run enterprises. Eventually, that led her to pursue financial planning, which was piquing her interest as a way to bring together planning, education, and action to empower clients and their understanding of their personal finances. Vera currently lives in close community on Pennacook land with her dog, chickens, and garden. And in this episode, we also talk about the quote-unquote big, beautiful bill, the budget and tax bill that is currently in the Senate. By the time you listen to this episode, that bill might have passed. That bill might have gone back for further changes and edits. So just want to name that what we share in this episode might be outdated by the time it reaches your ears. Welcome, Vera. I am so excited to have you on the show as one of my mentors in this space. And usually for guests on the show, I ask them to share their money story, which is your own personal story about the way that money has moved throughout your life, has shaped you, any systemic conditions that influenced that. So I'll invite you to share as much or as little as you'd like, Vera, and introduce yourself in your own words with listeners.
Thank you so much, Jordan. This was really exciting, and thanks for the invitation to have this conversation and share my story. I think a lot about, as a financial planner, that people sit with me and share their stories all day. I listen to money stories of different flavors, right? And listening to the money stories here was really inspiring too. So I was thinking about where I fall in time and space and place in the world. And my money story, I think, has its main themes are about having privilege with a time without access to wealth, and privilege with a time with access to wealth. And, I was born in the mid 80s, and my parents separated when I was 4. So I was raised by a single mom for my whole childhood. We had inconsistent child support. It was a tough time for many years. There were long battles between my parents, and my mother went to school. She put herself through night school. She took care of us. She got a job in a new field to her, and she worked. And I learned, right, like, we grew up on a budget with my mom working really hard. So we knew, that there were rules about when you would turn the heat on, and like how to unit price shop at the grocery store, and that like we are doing the things that we're doing because this is how we survive in a world where things are not stable or consistent, right? And there are things within our control and there are things that are outside of our control. And so, this was at the same time, I was raised in the smallest house in a wealthy community. I went to very good public schools. I was part of a religious community that was full of kind and generous people who had access to different kinds of wealth. And so I went to high school. And when I was applying to college, I deferred for a year. And then I was excited to start a year later as intended, but I had to defer for another year because of financial aid, confusions, and issues having long-term divorced parents with a hard fought divorce agreement that was not really honored or understood by the financial aid department. So I took another year off to sort of figure out how we were going to pay for this. And I took out loans and went through college, and my mother helped me to pay the bills through school. But at some point, we ran out and we're sort of relying on, like, is the institution going to be able to step up, right? My mother went and asked her parents, who declined. She then asked a friend from our religious community who lent her money so that I could finish college. And I knew how much my mother valued education and had taken that on for herself and being able to do that. And so to see her, right, go to full length, to do that. Well, at the same time, I also knew, like, my grandparents, like, seemed pretty comfortable. They lived in a really big fancy house. We would go over there for holidays. We would have meals that felt luxuriously extravagant and like furniture that I had never seen before. And I was like, we're working so hard. You're working so hard, right? To like go to night school and do all of this stuff, and how we stock the fridge is complicated. But then we go here to this place where there's so much. And it created this sort of dichotomy in my experience of growing up of not really understanding like what wealth or privilege or access or exposure to wealth meant, right? And so I ended up starting college in 2006. So I graduated in 2010 in the middle of the financial crisis. So, and then in 2011, my grandfather passed away, and my mother inherited her portion of part of my grandfather's estate that was split between her and her three siblings. My grandfather had a second wife who had been my step grandmother for my entire life, but there was a lot of intergenerational conversations and feelings that arose with this, and a lot of mystery, non-communication. And then I remember one day when I was driving my car to my therapy appointment, and I parked, and my mom called me and she said, "So I wanted to let you know I'm going to pay off your student loans." And I said, "Oh, what?" And she said, "Well, as you know, your grandfather passed away. And something that you might not know is that he didn't really think that it was worthwhile to invest in women's education. And that's why your uncle had his college education paid for, and why I did not. And so I went to a state school and she paid for herself." And she said, "And it was really hard for me to do that. And I don't want you to have to do that." And he didn't believe in that, but I do. And my mom paid off my federal student loans, and she paid back the family friends who had lent us money for me to go to school. And so that allowed me a moment of change in how I could operate and orient in the world. I did not have private student loan debt. So I'm lucky if I know the rules. That, right, means I had 5 figures or less, right, by the time that I graduated. But it was still just an unbelievable burden. And having also gone through my growing up, knowing that this was just going to be a big part of the budget. And what's the temperature I'm going to keep my own future house at? And like, how do I do this? Right. And so having my student loans paid, having my mother move into a state of financial, like all the way on the spectrum from a state of working in public service. She was a public library director for years and not getting the support that she needed, right? To having a sum of money and to her to make this gift to me. And then for her to be in a comfortable position left me in an orientation that I had also never been in before, which is like my parent being okay. The end part of this story, right, is that, I was able to orient myself out of nonprofit work and move into becoming a financial planner and then becoming a financial advisor. And I started doing that in 2012. And in the couple of years after my grandfather passed away and we were sorting through his various belongings. And I knew my grandfather had been in finance. That was like he was a banker. Sometimes people say he was a banker, right? I learned the most about my grandfather, though I knew so much. I learned the most about him from his obituary and then the things I was able to ask my mother about and my aunts and uncles afterwards. And it turned out that not only had my grandfather been a banker in New Hampshire, he had also worked for First National Bank of Boston as a vice president. He worked for Kidder Peabody as a financial broker. He returned to New Hampshire and worked with the governor and was a vice president for the financial commissions in New Hampshire. And in his later retired years, he served as the chairman of the board for the Dana-Farber Cancer Center. In his later years, he identified as a country banker and a financial broker. And what I found in his records was that he was, in fact, a registered investment advisor. He was an RIA. That, of course, has wound up to be my chosen field. And I did not know that my grandfather was an RIA. When I joined to work for one, was mentored by a woman in this field, took over and owned and have grown an RIA. And my step-grandmother said to me a couple of years after he died, your grandfather would be really proud of you. I thought about that, and that's all really moving. And in the 10 years since then, I feel so boldly that both he would be very proud of some things and he would be very challenged. He would be very challenged by some of the things that I am doing. And he's not here to have that conversation. And like, that's okay, because this is part of the next generation of the money story about what's happening. But it felt profound to me that he did not think it was worth it to invest in my mother's education, nor my own, when asked to support. And yet I followed in his footsteps, and I'm proud to be where I am, to be doing things with a spirit of inspiration from the past, but evolution and commitment to difference and justice and equality. So
Yeah.
I'm arriving here in that moment in my story. So thanks for letting me share.
Thank you, Vera. That was, wow. I'm just like feeling the power of I'm like getting teary-eyed myself. I know listeners can't see that, but I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so touching and moving. And I think so much of, when we first like sharing money stories out loud, it also gives us the power to reclaim them and to write a different narrative. And that's what I really hear from you. Is like, I am doing something similar, and yet I'm doing it in a way that's reparative, that's really like writing a different legacy and a different lineage. And so I just really, thank you for sharing all of that. And wow, those systemic conditions like sexism and the ability, like all of the ways in which wealthy people are enabled to hoard wealth, which actually does block the flow of wealth back into people we love, into our communities. And it's like, those resources exist. If our government prioritized it, no one has to take out student loans. So just really feeling that, and then like you directly understand what that's like, and seeing the hardship that it puts on individual people like your mom and yourself. So yeah, just really Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Jordan.
that. So thank you. And you're also someone I know who has a pretty powerful politic. And so I'm imagining the economic conditions you were raised in influence that as well. But as much as you want to share for listeners, can you share a little bit more about what informed your politic and kind of how you identify as, someone who, yes, is running an RIA, is a financial advisor, but also very deeply wants to transform the system. So anything you want to share about that?
Yeah. So my studies were in economics, but with a focus on like Marxist economic tradition, which focuses on an understanding of the material conditions that exist but change throughout time and history, right? As they overlay with the mechanisms of capitalism will express themselves in different ways. And those conditions will define what the movements look like and the experiences, right, that come out of that time. So when I think about the 2008, 2009 economic crisis and, employment crisis after that, in addition to everything that was happening during the time, sort of focusing what I understood about economics, it was also a time and a world of thinking a lot about work and jobs and employers and how to get a job, and nobody was getting a job. And so when I think about, it was also an exciting time in the labor movement, right? Like just in general, I was an early organizer with the Starbucks Workers Union in New York City when it was teeny tiny and everybody was like, you can never organize Starbucks. Well, we did for a couple of years and then it went away. Seeds get planted, next things bloom. I would say thinking about work and its orientation in that way as what does it mean to be a worker or a capitalist, a person selling their time versus buying other people's time, right? And when I left college, I was in a position of selling my time to other people in exchange. And in 2020, when my mentor retired, I became the owner of the firm and was in a position of then employing other people. So that was not ever something, that I had planned for, right? I sort of rolled into doing financial planning because I wanted to be able to give people advice about a world that was causing harm for people all around them. I called it driving without a driver's license. Like they just give us these things called like a job, and then like somehow you're supposed to know you have a checking account, and then like this happens. I was like, this is not working. And that most of those roots start with like, what are we doing for work? Where does our money come from? Right. And like, what are we literally doing every day? So, and my mentor also had never envisioned having an employee one day, but then I was her employee for 6 years. And then we became business partners. And 2 years later, she retired. And so when I started to hire people to work with me, that was the quickest turnaround for me, right? Was that like 2 years earlier, I had been an employee, then I was a co-owner, and now I'm not an employee at all anymore. So I was like, what can I do to make this the best possible place I can to work within like the sphere of what's within my control, right? And so that was something that I really took to heart in being like, we can be a good example of not only how to be a financial firm, but also just a small employer. I think coming in to a firm in 2012, the firm was originally established in 1999. So by the time I took over in 2020, it had been around for over 20 years. So we just had our 25th year in existence. And
Birthday.
isn't that wild, right? I'm like, just wait for our Saturn return, baby. So, but I think coming into my identity as an institution and like that we can be an institution and what's our strength in representing that and speaking our politics, right? And being the institution that we think others should aspire to be interested, right, in striving towards something. Doesn't have to be just like this, but through a spirit and an iteration that's right for them. I think back to what would my grandfather have done as an RAA, right? I can hear him. Get legal advice. Take that advice. Get compliance advice. Take that advice. So I thought, okay, I'm going to get some legal advice. I'm going to get compliance advice. And like I talked and I built relationships with other professionals that I trusted to say, this is the kind of workspace that I want to create. So I work with an employment attorney who helped us develop an employee handbook that not only is compliant, but also reflects our values, right? That actually deeply, right? That I can say, here's all the things I would like love to be able to do. How do I express that? It's like a financial plan, right? So I love it.
Yeah.
Getting compliance advice that says, hi, I will be pointing to investments that might be described in this way. They might have 0% returns, right? They might fall into these quality or risk categories, right? What are my obligations through the lens of compliance, right? And to ask that question and know that I am standing up as a 25-year-old firm and saying, hi, I'd like to get some information. Full story. I looked at an account statement for a wealth management firm that was founded in 1890.
Oh my gosh.
Look, wildly huge position in cryptocurrency Bitcoin trust. I thought, they are not worried. These folks over here, established 1890, they're not worried. They're not worried about this huge. They're like, yeah, we're doing that. And why? Because we've got institutional cred. And it's got a ticker and it goes right on your account statement. So I feel the same amount of confidence, or I seek to aspire to the same amount of confidence, right? That you can have a harm reducing investment that could be considered different, is meant to be different, right? But also it is worth embracing difference, bringing in new things, taking risks. That is what the whole point is. This is the movement to do. I think that it's this idea of where do we start first in our strength? If you want to clean up your side of the street first, to like look at yourself as an employer. If you're not an RAA that's an employer, to look at yourself in relation to others in your community. You definitely have colleagues, right? So like, what's our relationship there? How are we expressing our values? How are we intentionally or unintentionally engaging in extraction? How can we think creatively that not everything needs to look equally, perfectly reciprocity, but it needs to be balanced and we can share and care for each other, right? These are radical concepts, right? But actually, like when you do that internally and in your workplace and then in your community, I actually feel very bolstered to stand up and say the next right thing that I know is right to do in the world, which is to do alternative investments, alternatives to what we have right now, because what we have right now to choose from is absolutely bananas.
What I'm really hearing you say is because this firm has been around since the 1800s, has been around for so long, has so much trust and credibility, like we get to do different things that might be considered experimental or might be considered something of like, whoa, that's way out of the norm. And so we also have that possibility when it comes to solidarity economy investments, community investments, and the alternatives that you're mentioning are alternatives that actually provide social value and not just market rate returns. So thank you for painting that so clearly. And I would love to go back. Well, there's two things as you were talking that made me just like, ooh, it's making me think a lot about how we need teams of co-conspirators. If we don't have a lawyer that's going to back us and really help us think creatively, it's going to limit the extent of what we can do. So we also need the professionals that have our shared values and want to support us in being creative and see the purpose of what we're doing. And then also, I'd love to just circle back a little bit as you were talking about how you structured Saltbox to be the workplace that you want it to be. Could you just share a little bit about what does that practically look like? And what would you say if you were to compare Saltbox to a more traditional RIA, like maybe the place where your grandfather worked versus where what you've cultivated and created? Like what's different and what does that look like?
What a great question. Yeah, we call it TradFi in my office,
Trad.
right? So yes, we're like, oh, you had an experience in TradFi that sounds really challenging, right? So I was really lucky to be only had this experience of working one-on-one with a mentor in the financial services world. So my experience, right, like I hear from others and money employees who share with me, right, like what it is like to work in TradFi. One of the most important things to me was how we operate. How do we actually operate? Less so how are we legally structured. How we're legally structured is an institutional decision that is part of a long-term trajectory plan towards more democracy. But how do we operate? We need to operate as cooperatively, collectively, and with strength, but with clear duties and delegations and shared responsibilities and ability for there to be shared ownership. So that the folks who are working in stasis and doing a client service or working with the CRM, they get to have ownership, right, over that space that they are the most knowledgeable about. And I think the on paper very structured ways, right? Again, I mentioned our employee handbook. Took very seriously that as an employer, I am imbued with an incredible amount of power under capitalism over other people. And so in all relationships of power engagement, marriage is another one. It's important that we break things down and we discuss and understand what are the power dynamics, right? And so having an employee handbook that stated, these are my responsibilities to you, these are the promises, and these are the commitments. These are both the legal obligations that I have, and also the choices and things that I wish to build into this space. And in exchange, this is the time commitment that we ask from you, right? The wage and the engagement in this space as a space of like learning and growing and operating collectively. So it was really important to me also in that space to actually institutionalize what are sometimes just like good practices, right? Or people do at a firm because it's friendly, like, oh, we work sort of shorter days on Fridays in the summer, maybe, right? Or, oh, if you need a couple of extra days off to go do a thing, we'll give you time to do that. Write that down. Make it a policy. Make it clear. It can't just be a preference or like a tradition. Write it down. And if you don't have a policy about it, then you don't have one. Talk to people actually about things like, what does it take to invest in your work? Do you have to buy a mouse? Can I buy you a piece of tool or equipment? Do you know how easy it is for me to buy a mouse for somebody? So we need to start from this place of like, the people who are joining us are giving us the most precious gift, which is of their time. And at a bare minimum, I aim to equip them with the tools, the focus, the energy, and the readable, accessible commitment to what kind of workplace we're building and what service we're bringing to our clients. So, yeah.
I mean, it feels more like a sharing of power versus I'm the boss and what I say goes, and I'm the only one with decision-making power. And it's making me think too about when we think about a just transition, which is a concept that I've brought up in several episodes, probably a need to do a deeper dive at some point on this show. But when we think about a just transition, I think there's a lot of, if I just like zoom out, a lot of skepticism from people around like, can finance really be a tool to make that possible? And if so, how? When it's so rooted in extraction and hoarding. So I'm curious both where you see opportunities for RIAs, registered investment advisors, essentially a financial advising firm, a wealth management firm, potentially, where to be accountable to social justice movements. And how does that connect with what you view as Vera as a person, Vera's work to do, and the role that you're trying to play in the larger movement towards social justice?
It's such an important question because what feels so, archaic and, somehow both like extractive, strong, archaic, but also old fashioned about, right, the financial system, right, is that it feels sort of invulnerable to change, right? It has its own very strong armor. I think my role with the particular facets of my money story or orientation towards it is to sort of be like a code switcher, co-conspirator, right? I'm queer, I'm anti-capitalist, like I have radical politics. And I also run an institutional firm. So I get to go into meetings or behind doors, not only behind doors, but sometimes down hallways that they don't tell you exist. And then behind doors into meetings where we're confronting the wealth defense industry. And so I'm allowed into those spaces and I carry with me a whole lot of that. My role is to like speak truth to power in a space, in a way that they must listen, right? They may only accept me there because of my professional credentialing or my authority or invitation. They may not respect what I have to say, but they need to listen, respond, and digest. I see my role in that as to be an agitator to like create some change within this. And then also ultimately as an educator, because I think one of the things that is so uniquely hard about finance is how much of it is mysterious. And so for me, that accountability back to movement that can be an organization, can be my clients, is to say, let me break it down for you, what we heard in that room. Let me tell you, these are the things that were said. Here are the responses. Now we're here. And then say, what questions do you have? What do you understand now? What do you next want to know? And then I can take that and I go back into the room. And so that's, I see that role to be the fascia between the TradFi and the new, right? And also to, yes, find other professional co-conspirators like attorneys, like others, right, who we can build this out. So we have more power behind us when we're interacting with the traditional finance.
Yeah. And it's bringing to mind this version of a translator, of translating all of this jargon and all of this institutional legalese a lot of the time to then putting it in plain language, plain speak, to be like, okay, this is what's actually happening. It's the equivalent of one sentence. And then going back and forth to really center what's best for the people we work with, but also the communities that they're a part of and the collective beyond them. And it's also bringing to mind in groups like Surge and, calling on people who have white privilege to use that to dismantle white supremacy in the same way. Folks who have access to spaces where wealth is hoarded or are part of this wealth defense industry to use their privilege to dismantle that. So that's what I'm hearing from a lot of that.
And I think about what this means for a just transition, right? And part of this is building the new. But when I show up in the office space as a radical advisor and we have a CPA, we have an attorney there, we have another different kind of attorney, we have a trustee. If we can replace each one of those component parts with a radical component. So can we have an estate planning attorney who's in the room, who's not your great-grandparents' estate planning attorney? Can we replace with a healthcare advisor that's needed to facilitate? The dream would be Theseus's queer ship, right? Like, we are going to replace the ship as it is moving along. We can't just build our own ship on the shore. We need to take off the parts and replace them with new parts as it continues, right? Along.
Exactly.
So, and then it arrives on the new shores, right? And it's looking transitioned. It's looking changed.
Mm-hmm. You're like, damn, this is a hot ship sailing over.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that visual. And it's making me think too about this has come up a lot in other conversations I've had with folks, but how much of it is sitting in and holding contradiction. Like, how is it that we're sailing this ship? We're not going to let it sink, but we're going to get to this new shore completely transformed with our new ship. That contradiction that comes with with both resisting and building at the same time. And also the contradiction of like being, I mean, technically, like on paper, right, being a manager or a boss or having like a power dynamic between employees, but also trying to center a workplace that reflects something different. Anything you want to speak to around that contradiction and what it's like and how you move through it?
I think, again, part of our story or my story and the firm's story, right, which is not universally applicable, but the firm have gone through its challenges. And when you've been around for 25 years, there are experiences and things that happen and change. One of the things that is important to me in understanding as I was stewarding this space was also to understand what it was creating, which was a space for community and work coworkership, for people to have jobs, for them to have benefits, and that my role was to make sure that that would be protected. So the firm has been challenged over the years, and we faced other challenges, some existential, some not. And so for me, it was a decision about maintaining individual ownership of the firm to make sure that we could steward several years of pretty epic challenges while operating with cooperative principles. The difference is that we do not have a cooperative ownership structure as of this moment. But part of that was a decision around what I was trying to protect over the past couple of years. And also, as we're building in and really locking in our forms of institutional protection to continue to do what we do, which involves advising our clients, protecting our clients and their families, that we can continue to do that in a way that's legally protected. And so the ways otherwise that like engaging and being in a workplace are that we make democratic decisions around scheduling. We do not work a 40-hour work week. We have participation in deciding what our various employee benefits are and which ones we would like. We have shared decision making in as many things as possible that are important, and independent autonomy in as many areas as we can possibly give. At this point, really only retain exclusive responsibility for compliance and human resources management. But there are real challenges, right? When I think about, sometimes, let's say in the nonprofit world, like nonprofit is just a tax status. It's not an operating model, right? And so S Corp is a sole ownership tax status, not an operating model. So I have a different operating model, absolutely. And I believe that how you operate in the world is what's most important.
I was just listening to a podcast that Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba were on, talking about their book, Let This Radicalize You. And they were talking about how like practicing at the smallest level, like how we are at the small is how we are at the big. The smaller we can go and actually truly live into the ways of being that we want to center, that is how we actually make these large transformative change happen, by actually doing the thing. So thank you. And I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit because you are someone that I think of as an expert in taxes. And we also are in the middle of this, Chuck Collins on the last episode called it the big billionaire bill, but what Trump is calling the big beautiful bill, really recodifying or trying to codify a lot of tax breaks for the ultra wealthy. I know you know way more about this bill than I do. Can you share a little bit about what are the ramifications, like if this goes through as it currently is? What are the ramifications in both the short term and the long term? And for those who aren't as familiar with the bill, just any context that you want to provide around it.
Yeah, certainly. I despise the acronym for this bill, but I like to think, a BBB rated bond is not a good bond. So this is not a good bill, like for sure. I'm super into taxes because, again, it's kind of the place where they have to write down it's a contract the federal government, where they write down and say, this is what we think is important and what we don't think is important. And so in terms of how we think about tax literacy and tax justice, right, it comes from actually looking at and understanding some of the things that are really in bills like this, but it's hard and it's complicated, and they make it complicated for a reason. So I think one of the top line things that most folks have already probably heard about is that it would make the current tax brackets and the tax rates permanent. The current tax rates that we're under right now as the TCJA tax code from 2017. And so we're at the lowest tax rates in American history. And this would make those permanent until somebody else comes along and wants to make them even lower. But I had a client who turned 80 years old this year, and when he asked me what he should set in his tax withholding ratings for his retirement account, how could he know given the current tax history or tax code? And so I calculated that for the first 50% of his life, the middle to upper tax rates were 50 to 90%. And then for the next quarter of his life, they were 30 to 40%. And for the last 20 years, they've been 20 to 35%. So I said, but 50% of your lifetime, the marginal rates were 90.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and also thinking about the
me,
programs, the access to the programs and social services that were also available during those higher tax times. So,
oh, absolutely. No, this is the opposite direction of where we need to go. But this would be making those tax rate adjustments downward permanent. These adjustments by far benefit the wealthy because they are so heavily weighted towards exposure, right, in the lower tax brackets. But the other thing that this would do that helps wealthy people is that it would raise the amount of taxes that you can deduct off your federal tax return. So wealthy folks who pay a lot in property taxes or income taxes, right now they can only deduct a certain amount of that on their tax return, and this would quadruple that limit. So this is a thing that will provide an immediate multiple $1,000 benefit to the highest income earners. And it would permanently make the estate tax exemption amount to be $15 million. And so TCJA.
Can you just expand on what is that? Like for someone who's not familiar with an estate tax, what does that mean?
Yeah, for sure. So most of the time, if we pass away in the United States and you have any assets left, they're not going to be subject to taxes. So it would only be subject to tax at the federal government level many years ago. If you had more than $5 million, approximately, they then doubled that limit to just over 10. Then it went up to 11. This is per individual. And this legislation would make it 15. That means there is no tax assessed upon your estate unless you have more than $15 million. So the estate tax just simply does not apply to 99% of people. So when they continue to move the exemption from 11 million to 13 million to 15 million, that is just a gift to the people who have estates of that size. And the estate tax is a funding mechanism for the United States. So doing this, it is literally that this is wealth defense gifts right here. Things that the bill does that hurts regular people is makes certain limits on things that you can deduct permanent. So an example of if your entire home burned down in a California wildfire, right? You are allowed to deduct the cost minus reimbursements, right, on your tax returns. This extends and makes permanent a cap on how much you can write off if you've had a casualty loss or otherwise if you've lost everything that you own. This makes the rules tighter and the standards higher for some of the most important tax credits for both working and low-income people, which is the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, which is for anyone who makes below a certain amount of money, premium tax credits on your health insurance. So now the questions that you have to answer, the rules, what can be included, excluded, all a little tighter. There's also a limit on how much they could, is what's called claw back healthcare advance premium that had been paid to you. And so they are removing the limitations on that so the government can claw back benefits and tax credits paid. It also gets rid of things like electric vehicle and residential energy efficiency credits, which are for homeowners.
So it's like, okay, we're going to make everything harder to really provide any benefit to average, not even average, but like your everyday person on the street. I'm going to have to go through more rigorous processes to get any benefit for healthcare, more rigorous processes if your home or wherever you live is affected by climate change, which is only likely to increase. So you're really laying that foundation of here's how things are going to get more hard and have a higher level of surveillance from the state to even receive any degree of benefit. Thank you. Please keep going, but just wanted to like make that super.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that, sometimes it's really hard to know the nitty gritty of this as like, for example, if you're doing your own tax returns or TurboTax or something like that, you have kids and you put in, their information, it goes through and you get the child tax credit. The tax software is automatically answering yes to you for a standard set of 9 questions that are frankly fairly highly invasive that ask you several things about this child, this dependent. Is this your own child? Did it live with you? Do you have proof of this? Do you see legitimate proof that this is the child? You don't see that when you're doing your own taxes because the software doesn't show it. It just answers yes. When we look at this, we have to check off and say, yes, I verified all these things about this person's child. They're going to be adding more questions to that list. So it's invisibilized to some people, but it is there. And then it's printed out on a piece of paper and they could point out it later and say, see, you didn't answer this question correctly. We don't like the answer to this question. You now are no longer eligible for this credit. The ways, 2 of what I find to be very interesting changes that are going to come wrapped up with some, hey, this is going to be a good thing for working folks, right? But it's really, when I said, the thing about taxes is where the government writes down and says, this is what we think is important, right? We don't think it's that important if you have a kid or if you're low income because we're going to ask you a million questions. We are going to give you a tax write-off for your car loan interest. Not probably going to be a whole high standard of proof there, but 2 changes here is making auto loan interest deductible for both people who itemize, but also those who take the standard deduction. So this is really important because like this deductibility would apply to almost anybody who has to file a tax return and has a car loan note, okay, that they pay interest on. What does this do? This benefits the car companies, okay? They are making it is very expensive to buy a vehicle. Many, many people have to finance the purchasing of a vehicle. It is the number one thing that if we can avoid financing it, we should not. It's a depreciating asset. This written into the tax code says, hey, that's great. We incentivize that. Yeah, go take out a car note. Who cares if it's at 12% interest? That's not tax deductible, right? It's just temporary because all the kickbacks to rich people are permanent and any of these other things that might provide a benefit temporarily to working people are temporary. The other piece of this was much talked about is that it excludes taxation on tips for people who work in customarily tipped industries, and it excludes highly compensated employees. So there was like a lot of conversation about whether, lawyers could turn to just being tipped or financial advisors. So they have put a limitation on that. It says only traditionally and customarily tipped industries, and that's going to be tax deductible up to whatever limitation. So this also, number one, is this going to have any increase on actual tipping activities in the United States? I would highly doubt it. If anything, this, again, narrowly focuses benefits and rule changes for one industry. The food service industry is one of the largest single employers in America, over 15% of the workforce. So this is, again, a temporary adjustment, provides some benefit potentially to tipped employees. We don't know what this is going to do to your Social Security income's earning history. We don't know what this is going to do to any future ineligibility for benefits. Where will it get added back on? What is your state going to think about this? This is just the federal government, okay? And it is oriented towards a specific policy for a specific industry that absolutely has benefits for the employers and the capital owners in that industry. There is marginal, perhaps temporary, perhaps no, and potentially negative benefit for employees. Those two, deductibility of tips and deductibility of car loan interest, they're going to say these are great for working people, but it just pushes more people, right, into both financing vehicles. These are things that people are going to have to do regardless, but to promote them as financially beneficial, healthy, otherwise. And this is going to be used as another way to extract from people.
That was super, super. I'm just like so appreciate your knowledge and like the in-depthness here. And I think what's also true is this is just the bill itself. But if we also think about, okay, where are taxes, how is that tax revenue being used? If we're cutting SNAP, if we're cutting social services, does it matter that your tip revenue is not taxed as heavily? Is that going to actually change your cost of living?
Right.
Right.
Yep.
So yeah, just really being able to tie it back into that larger picture of how are all of these going to impact our lives. And then also with everything now happening in Iran, in Gaza, continuing to fund this war machine. That's the other like big part of, okay, where is this tax revenue going? And it kind of leads me to this philosophical, maybe it's not philosophical, but more existential question for you, Vera, which is, do you think that there is a world where you can use finance and, taxation being one of those pillars within finance, but where finance can be used to actually be a tool? Like if we think about that boat analogy, we're replacing the parts. Yeah. Do you think that's possible? And if so, where do you see the most promising opportunities or possibilities?
I feel deeply invested and emboldened that the financial industry can be a place for radical action to happen. We have one of the things about finance that makes it feels like money's been around forever. It feels like, these are just things. The system that we all materially live in and today was constructed, okay? Most of it was constructed within many people on this planet's living lifetimes, but several of it within the past couple of 100 years. But if we actually think about finance and markets and exchange, it has roots as old as law or medicine. It is something that happens when human beings come together in one way, shape, or form. And so finance itself, right? When I think about this, I'm like, it itself is not inherently impossible to be a vehicle for the means of change. But we have to take it all the way back to what its purpose is, right? And to say, when we say, I'm an investor, right? We're like, oh, you're a Wall Street, right? Like, what do you mean you're an investor? Who would identify as an investor, right? Like, no, but how can we take that word and say like, no, I am an investor in this world, in what is happening in this place and this space and my community. And so when I say investor, you should say what kind, and I can tell you what I invest in, right? Like not in this way. I think there are many different avenues for change, but I think I take inspiration from patient-led movements in medical care that say, hey, it's important that practitioners listen to us. It's important that pain specialists listen to women or femme folks. It's important, right, that we listen to patients. And there has been a change, right, over the past several years in patient rights, patient advocacy, healthcare advocacy, people finding their own voices and speaking up and understanding what the right care might mean for them. And so I see that, and no one's worried about like the medical industry collapsing on itself, but it's like, no, it will continue to evolve and grow, and it will evolve and grow as the participants in it demand that it rise to meet their needs. So I see finance as the same way. This is not a system. It's not a human organizing system that's going anywhere anytime soon, but it can be changed. It can evolve. We created it. In the medical field, they take their first oath is do no harm. Can you imagine if we took that oath in the financial industry? It actually wouldn't work. So let's roll back and say, what are the oaths that we are taking? How can we evolve? What would it mean if I, as an RIA owner, say our first oath is do no harm, right? And then we're going to orient from there going forward. I got other duties, I got other responsibilities, right? But I see it as when I listen to my clients and when they share with me their fears, their wants, their needs, their excitements, to respond to that is my fiduciary duty. At a very minimum, it is to listen and to not be dismissive, and then to understand what is my role in helping to create the world, right, that they wish to live in. I cannot do all of it, but I can do an important part of it, and I can share with them what they can do. And so if we want to talk about climate risk, if we want to talk about queer family risk, if we want to talk about moving money and making change, and if a regulator wants to come and talk to me about that, that is absolutely my fiduciary duty to have those conversations. I understand that. I believe that so much. And if other advisors, planners, coaches to know, right, I'm listening to what my client, to what my patient needs, right? And I'm responding to meet their needs. That's an okay thing to do. And we have to do it to survive in the future.
Ugh, yes. And it's really making me think about like the upstream of why donor organizing spaces are so desperately needed and so important to actually help people who have this privilege get clear on what do I, like, how do I factor myself in? But it's also, it's not like I exist as this individual and I'm like beepity boppity and living my life. We actually are so interdependent on each other. And those spaces help us also articulate what we need and want so that our professionals listen to us. So thank you. And we covered a lot in this conversation, and I just want to make space for anything else you want to share. Phrased another way, if you could wave a magic wand, what do you wish that listeners of the show already knew about?
That they can be part of this in their own spaces and their own lives by asking the questions and speaking out their needs, their wishes, their interests to their financial professionals, to their parents, to their tax preparer, to raise the questions, right? To be able to, and we can find that in some small ways or bigger ways. There's other stories of inspiration here, but we have a right to ask these questions, right? And to share about how things are impacting our lives in this moment. And so for folks to be able to take a look around and say, where is the space of something where I don't feel as like great about this, even if it is with you like your tax person, or maybe you're with an advisor that's working, let's keep pushing, right? Keep pushing to feel like you understand, you feel excitement, you feel full investment in what you have. And so that means like it's an ongoing journey. As the world continues to change, don't be afraid to evolve. The evolution and growth and change takes a little friction. So yeah, I want listeners to know that they're invited to do this now and to find ways in their own life.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's true, right? When we bring up these concepts, it might be the first time our tax preparer has ever thought about this, or the first time our mom or dad or our chosen family has ever thought about this. And by raising those questions, we're poking at a really deeply held belief and narrative that we've been socialized in. So it's not like the belief suddenly changes, but we're creating that internal moment to be like, wait, all of this that I thought was true, is it true? And if so, how is that possible? So I like that. Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.